I try to be open to it. I'm not the best at that because I do have, especially visually, I just have such strong images. When I read a play, the visual images are so overpowering that I sometimes tend to be not as open as I would like to be. But yes, absolutely, and it's the surprise when those people can surprise you. I mean, for example, in this show, there's a scene that calls for, it's a scene outside a chapel, and it's a moritat, it's a funeral. And I sort of thought, okay, wouldn't it be wonderful if we brought around one of those old drops of the trees where you have the net supporting the trees and all, and we can do little circular drops and could have done a nice outdoor scene. I thought, well, wouldn't that be nice? Whereas Dell, my set designer, said he came up with the notion of throwing a piece of black rose brocaded satin over the piano and adding a black vase with a bouquet of black roses, putting it on the piano, calling the piano bench a park bench and getting on with it. It was like, well, I wouldn't have thought of that, and it works wonderfully. It also worked wonderfully in terms of the budget. The black drape cost a couple $100 to accomplish, a can of spray paint for the roses, and probably saved ourselves $2,000 by doing something that was far more interesting than, although I like my original notion, but it's far more interesting, far more inventive, certainly, far more unexpected. So I like it when I'm startled, and I like to think I'm always open to when it isn't at all what I'd imagined. And so that is the challenge, to stay open to what you don't expect, which is about listening and again, trusting the craft of the people you've assembled. A lot of it is trust. Now, I know I have a friend who works at Indiana Rep a lot. He's a resident, James Still, who's written a number of plays that the Kansas City audience knows. And he's a KU graduate. They get together, their creative team, and they work nationally. We tend to work a little more locally. They get together for 3 weekends. 3 weekends with time between them as a part of their process. So that on the first weekend, you're not even looking for a solution. You're looking to expand the possibilities. You're not even thinking about how to solve it. And so, that's another version and a very high-end regional theater way to approach it. It's a very expensive proposition, but it can lead to extraordinary things when you have artists who are working that intimately. We do maybe 6 2-hour meetings over the course of 3 months. It's not the same as 3 weekends. I don't think it necessarily translates dollar for dollar. I mean, we often see where some little project at Met ends up touching us as much as a multi-million-dollar project somewhere else. There's no real direct corollary between how much you spend and how much you affect your audience. Quite the contrary, I think the less you spend, the more likely you are to sneak up on an audience. There's nothing more moving than going into some sort of alternative space, not like this one. I mean, this is a very commercial space, but going to an alternative space with a bunch of relatively inexperienced talents and suddenly having your soul touched. It's like, whoa, how did that happen? It happens to me all the time, and so I'll bring those young people in for auditions, and I end up where I can't necessarily cast them because the magic of that level of economic event made something special happen. But yes, there's always an economic aspect. There has to be, and certainly when times are hard, it becomes even more demanding. But Shane actually has something on his wall. It says, "We're out of money, we'll have to be creative." So there is something about not having money that demands creativity because you have to solve it some other way than with money. So it's not always, it's a painful demand, and this set, as simple as it is, was a couple $1,000 over my budget, and it's just like, well, I didn't mean to, but the woman who does this paint work, she's just the best. Laura Burkhart is just a brilliant, brilliant scenic artist. and she gets paid a third of what she's worth, and I still can't afford it, but nonetheless, you got to get it painted, and you don't want an amateur. So, yeah, the budget's always there, but you try and make it a challenge. I always say the column in the middle of the theater is your main inspiration. In fact, they're two big columns right up here. Right there is a column, a support column, and one on the other side. So that every set you see here is having to wrestle with these two columns. And we disguise them in different ways. In this case, it was sort of, well, we could use them, they're symmetrical, it's not a problem. But sometimes it's like, if we could just move those columns, So there's always, again, the challenge, the challenge is what allows the creativity. If you don't have a challenge, then why would you be creative? So the better the challenge is, the more interesting the creative response, because it challenges you to solve it some way. So I think probably it was a lot more autocratic in my early years. Just by sheer willpower, I would get it done and get it done better than it should have been done in the situation. So early on, it's just, there was just a lot of force involved in getting it to happen. At one point, I was in Chicago, an extraordinarily creative time in my life. My set designer lived across the courtyard. He'd been an instructor in my master's program, and then he became my set designer, did like 32 shows for me during my Chicago, Los Angeles days, and just an extraordinarily inventive person. But I mean, he kept a salon in the French sense of the word, where when the shades went up on his sunroom every morning, the creative world in Chicago was welcome. And so you would go there, and over the course of sitting in this sunroom for the day, these extraordinary people would just drop by. There'd be a jeweler, a costume designer, a set designer, an actor, a lighting designer, costumer. These people just sort of knew that you could drop in any time, and there would be some sort of salon going on where people would be talking about creative things and doing creative things. I mean, this is a man who his grocery lists would thrill because they were so beautifully executed, and even the grocery lists were art. So, I mean, it was an extraordinary salon. I actually took a course with him in my master's program called Design for Directors, so that he had the directors doing set designs by way of understanding what they do, but also just, But we always had to do a purely conceptual piece before we could even think about doing a set design. So I did a kismet where I made a functioning hash pipe that had orange rind and ginger in it, and aqua for the ocean and jewels and things. So there was this functioning hash pipe for kismet. I did a game for Oedipus Rex. You know those games where you push little plastic tiles around until you get them? Well, I did a God game, and I did a Parker's Brothers box and all, but each of these tiles was done in a texture that was appropriate to assorted characters. And then there was a blotch of blood that obscured the middle one and lapped onto the other ones. And if you got them in the right shape, that splotch of blood would make sense. And that's the kind of work that this man would ask of us before you even think about solving the demands of the show. It's first of all, just to work purely conceptually. Major influence in my life, visually. He's done a couple sets at Rep. The M Butterfly of Reps was his, which was one of the most beautiful sets I think anyone's ever seen over there. Stunning, stunning artist. Did a lot at the Goodman in Chicago. But yeah, where did that come from? That was just, I was thinking about those Chicago days. I forget what the question was that brought John Paletti up. But it was an extraordinary salon to have in my life. Not many people, I think, have one of those. Certainly not anymore. It was very kind of European. Joey Mantegna lived in the building. It was one of those times in Chicago, Malkovich, you'd run into at breakfast. Joan Allen, Laurie Metcalf lived in the next building. It's just like it was one of those extraordinarily creative times where just walking through the streets was pretty much a creative adventure.